afternoon, everyone. It is great to see so many of you hopping on with us today, and welcome back to many of you. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, I'm Maggie Mahan, the Assistant Director for Advancement and Engagement with the State Historical Society of Missouri. Thank you for joining us today as the coordinator of the Cape Girardeau Research Center, Bill Eddleman, presents the next installment in his genealogy series. All events and our virtual programming series are made possible thanks to the generous support of the Society's members and donors. You can visit our website to learn more and see how you can add or renew your support. So thank you again for joining us. And now I will turn it over to Bill. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Maggie. 17th, wow. I don't know what the 18th one will be at this point, so any ideas people might have for that one, just drop me a line. But we're going to talk today about immigration and naturalization records. And most people have in their minds a kind of a standard view of immigration as occurring around 1900 and coming in through Ellis Island and our Castle Garden, and people seeing the Statue of Liberty and spreading, and as with this quote that I've got here on the screen. But people were immigrating to the New World from the Old World for hundreds of years before that. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of a very shallow overview of all the vast resources that are out there to research immigration. Compared to many of the other things I've talked about, it's probably one of the most frustrating aspects of doing genealogical research. So if you remember, there's no one, remember throughout this, that there's no one record source where you can find an immigrant's ancestral home. Compared to many other types of records we've talked about, where there might be a pretty narrow path and a pretty circumscribed way to do things and search the records, it's really not that way with immigration records. The time period and the ethnic nature of the family that you're dealing with determine where to look. And if you are like me on my maternal side, I have a lot of early 1700s, late 1600s lines that came in Virginia and a few other places. They're really tough to try to determine the immigration time and how that worked, because there weren't any records kept. So if we look at different periods of U.S. immigration that kind of determine what sort of research you're able to do and how you might do it, think about colonial times. For most people who came to the U.S., to the Americas, there were really few requirements for coming other than some way of paying for the passage. Most people were within the British Empire, and so was kind of equivalent to if we were to go cross a state line. There's no record of us crossing the state line. It's within the same country. So the 13 original colonies and the eastern seaboard were just like part of Britain. So why keep records? The exception is Germans and other nationalities other than British Empire. They had to swear allegiance to the king in order to be allowed to be admitted, which did leave some records. From colonial times up to about 1790, the U.S. had a lot of other things to worry about other than regulating and circumscribing procedures for immigration. So if you look at the early part, right up to 1790 through the Revolution, the predominant ethnic group that came in was actually Africans for a time. And those of you that research African-American ancestry, that's very tough to do. Then English were also numerically large. Ulster or Ireland, Northern Ireland, Germany, Scotland, Ireland, that's now the Republic of Ireland, Netherlands, Wales, France, there were Jewish communities that came in early. In fact, there was a synagogue in Rhode Island quite early. And then Swedish and Finnish immigrants. In 1790, Congress finally passed an Immigration Act which excluded all non-whites from naturalization. There was a 2-year residency requirement, which was later raised to 5. It was raised to 14 during the Alien Sedition Act time period at the end of the century, but then it was dropped back to a 5-year residency requirement for naturalization. That pretty much held through 1820. Didn't leave very many records. There might be some records of the naturalization. There probably aren't that many of the actual arrival. From 1820 to 1893, passenger lists for ships bringing in immigrants started to be kept because of the Steerage Act of 1819, which required the ship's captain keep passenger lists. One of the other notable pieces of legislation during this time period, 73-year time period, was the Chinese Exclusion Act. Certain groups began to be excluded or at least prevented from being naturalized. And that's gone all over the place over time. On these lists, at best, you're going to get name, age, gender, occupation, the country of origin, the person's destination, and notes. Oftentimes the notes would be whether someone died en route or a few other things. But this is if you're lucky. If you're unlucky, well, there's no list at all, but a real bare bones list just has name, age, gender, and maybe occupation. So hope for the best there. During this time period, the dominant immigrant groups were Irish, Germans, and some others from mostly Northern Europe and Western Europe. In 1891, there was an Immigration Act passed, which became fully functional by 1893. One of the biggest things this did was establish a U.S. Office of Immigration. And ships' passenger lists became much more detailed by law. They were required to be during this time period. So what you might find, and this is a little bit more definite, might find compared to the previous time period, marital status, the last residence, oftentimes the town name, as well as the country, the person's final U.S. destination, where they're going. We want to know that because we want to keep track of people coming into the country. If you were in the U.S. at an earlier time period, they wanted to know where, when, and how long. The name, address, and relationship of a relative if they were joining one, which is very valuable genealogical information. Oftentimes the relationship is specifically mentioned. Literacy, whether the person had a train ticket to the final destination. Otherwise, they might be a public charge. Who paid for the passage? The amount of money carried. After 1906, and I so far have not researched anybody after 1906, barely, a description of the person and their birthplace, which not necessarily the last residence, so you might have additional information there. After 1907, the name and address of the closest relative in their native country as well. During this time period, the dominant immigrant group shifted to Eastern and Southern Europe. So particularly the Slavic areas of Eastern Europe and Italians being dominant groups. Remember some things about passenger lists after 1893. First of all, passenger lists are created in the port of departure, not in the port of arrival. So there's this persistent myth out there that, well, our name was this surname until the official at Ellis Island couldn't write it or couldn't pronounce it, and so they changed it. That's a myth. Because the name that's on there was created at the port of departure, not at Ellis Island. people changed their names for various reasons, but it was usually the person that had the name that did the changing. So people might change because their name was really not very pronounceable, or they maybe wanted to sound more American. I had a friend when I lived in Rhode Island whose last name was Simpson, and his grandfather had come over from Sweden and thought that Simpson sounded more American. So he changed it. I can't remember what the name was before. Spelling, though, still may be wildly incorrect. This is one of the things you really have to put up with immigration research, particularly doing search in databases, is wildly variant spellings, even to the point where I can't figure out why anyone would warp a spelling that badly. The spelling may be incorrect, and later employees may have, and employers and parents may have just said, okay, I guess what it is now, or they may have been anglicized as well. Okay, first of all, there is an error in your handout. The URL for laws that are of interest in immigration is obsolete. I took that off somehow on my computer and I failed to check it out. And so it was wrong. Well, here's the right one. If you want to take a screenshot of this screen, feel free. Don't take a screenshot of any of the rest of it, but this one is an error on the handout. The law in effect at the time affects what records are available and how they might be available in the process of immigration. So you have to be aware of those. Okay, let's look at the grand scheme of possible actions that occurred during an immigration event that might generate records. They're not present for everybody for every step. These are just potentials. So first of all, not so much in the late 1800s, more in the 1700s and before, particularly with Germans and others who came from various principalities that were not part of the British Empire. You needed to be released. You had to have permission to immigrate. Those may be recorded in a civil or church authority. In some cases, even in the British Empire, convict transportation records may have survived. These, of course, would be in England or the country sending the convicts out, not here. Sometimes at various steps, there were requirements for border crossings. And indeed, going down the Rhine River at certain points, every time you crossed a border, you were taxed. And there were toll stations where you were taxed to the point where many people may have just walked overland other than go down the Rhine River. So those border crossings may or may not have generated records. Compensation to the carrier. Most people, particularly later, paid right up front. They weren't allowed on the boat if they didn't. But early on, you had the option of indenturement. Indenturement was something that lasted for usually 7 years, and it was used to pay the passage to America. I found these really tough to research because there's a whole bunch of different places where you can find indenturement records. And those places include, there are no indenturement records that survive. I'm pretty sure I had some ancestors that may have taken this option because I know when they came over, and I know they don't appear in a record until years later. And the assumption is they might have been indentured. Nowadays, there seems to be this tendency for people to call this slavery. It's not slavery. It's an contractual agreement that you agree to work a certain length of time. And once that time is up, there may be an agreement that your employer may give you a suit of clothes or money or whatever, but you're free of the indenturement then. Ships, passenger lists, and manifests, which are kind of the coin of the realm in immigration research. At arrival, there may have been records generated. One of the principal ones I've seen a lot because I have Pennsylvania German ancestry on my dad's side of the family and a little on my mom's. They had to swear an oath of allegiance to the Crown of England, and those have survived oftentimes. it seems like there were different ways they did that. They may have just done it right at the courthouse, marched from a dock to the courthouse and signed the oath of allegiance. Or they may have done it actually in church services once they got there. I've seen that, in fact, with one ancestor that you'll hear about in a minute. There may be newspaper announcements for the boat's arrival, particularly in the mid 1800s. Maritime traffic was big news. People wanted to know when boats came in and what they were carrying. And if they were carrying a load of immigrants, that would be mentioned as well. Legal actions related to the ship or passage, if somebody did something nefarious like overloaded or mistreated the passengers, there might be some legal action taken. Arrival in a settlement location might have been generated mainly because it's a new person coming into the community. So you might see that in church records, particularly. They might have still had enough money to buy land, in which case they'd pop up in land records right after arrival. Declaration of intent to become a citizen, which was a step toward naturalization. And then finally, naturalization records. Then if people want to go back home, which they did do if they had the money, you would have to have a passport to do that. And this is particularly true as you move toward 1900 and beyond. The first step, if you're going to do immigration research on an ancestor, is to milk everything you can about that ancestor. You want to clearly identify them. Every piece of information you find about them has the potential to give you clues to their immigration. So a birth record, particularly of a child of theirs, might mention where they were from. I recently got my wife four more ancestors just from a marriage record in a Catholic church that I found. Another event in the originating country might have given you some clues. The place of origin, which is mentioned several places that I'll talk about. A relative, if you've researched the relatives, there might be a mention of where they came from, in which case your ancestor is a relative, so they may have come from the same location. Family traditions or heirlooms, just be cautious of those. They may be transplanted onto the wrong family, or they may be wrong. The friends, associates, and neighbors, you may want to research that group of people associated with your ancestor because they may have come from the same place. Religion, ethnicity, and name changes. All these might give you some clue as to where they immigrated from. Immigration information that you might be able to find here is the date, at least approximately, and we'll talk about some ways to do that. The departure place, the arrival port or city, the ship, and the reason for migrating. Reasons for migrating oftentimes get really erroneous. For example, one of the first things in one course on Pennsylvania German research I took at one point was everybody says that they came to America for religious freedom. However, in some cases, the Pilgrims had religious freedom. They were in Holland. Nobody bothered them about their religion. It's more likely that many individuals came for greater economic opportunity rather than for religious freedom. And the thing that the instructor mentioned about Pennsylvania Germans, at the same time Germans were coming to Pennsylvania, an equal or larger number were going east into Eastern Europe. It was to take advantage of open land and better economic opportunity and not religion, because certainly restrictions on religion were probably even greater as you headed east. Learn a little bit about the historical background for immigration for both the departure and arrival place, and it may give clues for what your ancestors were thinking when they did immigrate. First of all, numbers of immigrants in different time periods have been kind of roughly estimated. There's a chapter in a book called The Source in your handout And on page 445, you'll find a summary of that. Shifts in origin up to 1790, which I mentioned before. These were the primary origins. 1820 to 55, Ireland and Germany mainly, and after 1885, Southern and Eastern Europe. This graph carries right up to 2020, and you'll notice it's really drastically shifted. A lot more immigration from Asia and South America and Mexico. So you got to ask yourself, why did they leave? And that may give you clues. Know the laws and the process of immigration. So certain patterns may exist. Many people think, oh, they just pulled up, got on the boat, came over. Well, there may be multiple steps. Remember, the Pilgrims were in Holland and then came back to England and then finally to Massachusetts. There may be multiple steps like that for many people. They may not have been able to afford the full passage. And so there were Palatines, Germans, who, for example, just went as far as Ireland, and some of them never left. They stayed there. They have descendants today. Others picked up when they could afford it and took the last leg to America. Some of them didn't like it and went back. And some of them went back and then decided, well, maybe I made a bad decision there, and came back again. So be aware that is a possibility. People moved as communities for the most part, immigrants. The term applied to that is chain migration. For some reason, that's gotten a kind of an evil connotation, but frankly, it's always been chain migration. If you look at where I live in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, the county, something like 70 or 80% of all the German immigrants who came to America from Braunschweig came to Cape Girardeau County. And it's because a few people came, they liked it, they wrote letters home. People decided, well, things kind of stink here, let's give it a try. And pretty soon, whole communities of Braunschweigers were moving to Cape Girardeau County. And it operates that way in many places. I mentioned indentured servants. Some of the places to look for that are church registers, court records, deeds, servant contracts, which may be in public records or archives, journals and other personal narratives, land patents, merchant account books, newspapers, particularly when they ran away, tried to skip out on their indenturement. It would describe the person and they went missing and they owed another 5 years. Passenger lists and probate records. They might be mentioned in probate if their person to whom they were indentured died. But as I said, I've found it pretty difficult to work with indentured servant records. Use the correct research approaches, looking for any mentions of the person's origin, as I said. First of all, you have family and home sources. I will give you an example of my wife's great grandfather. And we started with some pretty nice documents just that her dad had. Previous research, many people may have worked on, and this is one thing that I think has really fallen away in recent years, is people corresponding with each other who are researching the same lines. It's a good way to get a jump start on some ancestors. And again, research the friends, associates, and relatives, and neighbors. You may get a clue from those. Well, let's look at some sources for place of origin that may specifically mention where they're from, or it may give you a clue to where they're from. First of all, and to be taken with a bit of a grain of salt, family histories. Oftentimes people at least speculated. And by the way, if you ever see any variant of the 3 brothers came over or 5 brothers came over, start to be suspicious, because that's an old one. It may be true, but usually it's not true. And of course, the brothers never go to the same place. They all scatter in different directions in the family story, but it's likely not the case. Various databases. Really useful are some books that are compendia, where different genealogical information is pooled together on a given individual and their family. Uh, Henry Jones, Henry Z. Jones, Hank Jones prepared a whole series of these on Palatine immigrants, that is, German immigrants from the 18th century. And he put it all together, and he had other people that were researching with him. And if you have an ancestor, and I've got more than one ancestor in his books, it's really valuable because he bases it on solid records and research. And that's just one example. Local histories and biographies, the way these operated, things like Goodspeed's histories or late 1800s county and regional histories, whoever wrote them had to pay for printing. And so what they did is they had a section of biographies, and they would put out the word. And if you contributed money toward the book being printed, you got a biography in the book. They call them mug books as well, because it's whoever could afford to be in there, and it's just all the people that were usually relatively well off. And it usually lists, if they were an immigrant, it usually lists where they were from, at least uh, the state, in this case, Baden. So if you have an ancestor that might have one of these, check it for the location you know your ancestor lived. And again, these are late 1800s, so it would be immigrants from the mid and early 1800s. Okay, the census, starting in 1850, the census listed place of birth. And that oftentimes is not as definitive as it could be. A lot of times it will list Germany, but in the case you see here, somebody wrote in Hanover. Well, that's a lot better than Germany because it narrows it down. Many of these census takers just wrote a general country name and not the specific principality. So be aware of that. But it tells you that your ancestor was an immigrant. As you move forward, this same thing was listed in the 1860, 1870 censuses, and then starting in 1880 and going through 1930, there is immigration information. And the one that's really valuable is somewhere out in the right-hand columns, depending on which year, the column may vary. It lists the year that an immigrant came to the country. Well, this is great. It allows you to narrow a search down. So in this case, this John Walters came in 1860 from Hanover, and Frederick Hahn came in 1842 from Germany. And his mother was born in Hanover, so that would be the first place I would think, potentially. Something that's really dropping from the scene, so check fast, is individual society orderlies and newsletters. And I say check first because many of these are disappearing. They're in libraries still, if the society sent it to libraries. But these are historical societies, immigrant societies that are focusing on a certain ancestral group, and genealogical societies. So it's really a shame that people don't join these groups anymore because they think it's all online, and by golly, it isn't. Similarly, many of these and other periodicals are indexed in something called a periodical source index, PERSI, which is done by the Allen County Public Library in Indiana. And what this is it indexes the table of contents from periodicals. So I'm going to give you the periodicals. You got to find those on your own, but you'll at least know there was an article there. And it's searchable by several different methods, as you can see here. And so it's a nice step toward a source. And then archival collections. If you have a chance on an archival collection, it's like gold. if the family members donated their family papers to an archives or many larger libraries. These would, of course, have the full story, usually, of the immigration of that ancestor. By the way, the Missouri State Genealogical Association is going to be meeting August 3rd, I believe, at the Center for Missouri Studies. And you'll have a chance to learn about using our archival collections and numerous other things that are at the State Historical Society. Vital record. And this is one example of a vital record. Of course, church records would be another, but this is a death certificate. And this is a guy named John Festi, which in German, that gives you fits. I have a Festi ancestors, and it's pronounced, I think, Fursta. And so it gets warped all over the place. A lot of people can only manage Foster. So again, check all spellings. And he was born in Hanover, according to the informant on his death certificate. And I mentioned church records. Kind of a neat thing that I don't see in this part of the country nearly as much. In the East, when I lived in Rhode Island, I saw this a lot. Individuals who had immigrated from Ireland, on their tombstones, on their grave markers, it states where they were from, what county. In this case, what town and what county. So look on Find a Grave, and you may find these, or Billion Graves. Newspapers, of course, if obituaries and similar information may give you a source. City directories usually don't give you a source, but they give you auxiliary information you can tie with other pieces to identify the right person and tie it with an immigrant. Military records and pension applications, and I will be giving you an example later. Social Security records. Of course, this would be immigrants from relatively recently, last 100 years. Homestead application files. If you were a naturalized immigrant or an unnaturalized alien, you had to list that on your homestead application. Okay, the coin of the realm, as I mentioned, for immigration studies is passenger lists. And there were a lot of them, and there is absolutely no one place to go to look at all of them. There is this very, very large source that was edited by P. William Philby that went with supplements for many years, and he just kept adding as he would find passenger lists. And you can go to a library and find these, but golly gee, they're on Ancestry, and they're searchable now. And I'll give you an example later of where I found somebody. So when I first started, you had to go find these in the library and use them. Various digital sources. If you want to really find a lot of digital sources, you can go to Ancestry or you can go to Family Search for free. And if you go to Family Search and you go to the search catalog option, use a keyword of passenger, and you'll get 1,482 results. And you may want to focus that down a little bit depending on what you're researching, but there's a lot of passenger lists there. There's a lot of books that you can at least get the citation for, and same thing on Ancestry. In fact, Ancestry and Family Search are almost essential today for immigration research. It used to be that all that stuff that's available on Ancestry and Family Search was on microfilm. And there is a book in your bibliography on your handout by John Philip Coletta called They Came in Ships. And it's really an entertainingly written book. But in the time he wrote this book, the primary way to do this was microfilm. And so he will mention all the microfilms. It's still valuable in that you may find out, hey, there's a database that was microfilm. I think I'll go look on Ancestry or Family Search and see if I can find it. So I can still recommend this book, even though I don't know that he's going to revise it again, but it's still got pretty good value. Of course, subscription services like Ancestry, and they have, when you do the search, click on search, you have an immigration and travel subset of information that you can click on. And when you do that, you'll get a search block, and you can narrow that by category. Includes passenger lists, citizenship and naturalization records. Um, I'll go over that in a minute. But as you look at this search block, I'll talk later about wildcards, but remember the problem with spelling on these ships' passenger lists. So uh, you may want to use wildcards to get around that, at least in part. Sometimes it's impossible to find the person, but you can narrow it by their birth year and location, where they lived, the approximate or known date of arrival. You go to the census, you get a year at least, you could enter it in here. And if you know or suspect what port they came in, if you know when they departed about, or any other event, like say a marriage date, you can narrow the search. So if you narrow by category, we've got options for passenger lists, citizenship and naturalization records, which is not by any means, none of these are complete. I don't know that they ever will be. Border crossings and passports, crew lists, immigration and e-migration books, and amazingly, a lot of the ships have surviving images that were used to carry the immigrants. And you can look online and find these, or you can look in Ancestry and try to find the ship and what it looked like. And I'll give you an example of where that came in handy. And they have featured data collections that changes up periodically that you can take a look at that may give you some more information. You can view all of these in the card catalog. You can view all of the immigration or passenger list informations in the card catalog. To review on the card catalog, this is something where I clicked on that, and this is what I got, 581 options in the card catalog. And you can, if you know the part of the title for what you're looking for, you can enter that, and you can enter keywords. Just remember, when you go back to that first search page, not all the collections they've got will be in here. You'll have to use the card catalog to get to everything, and it's kind of tricky sometimes. Most people get all hung up on New York being the port. Again, know the time period. In colonial times, the ports were all up and down the East Coast. The main ones were probably Boston and Philadelphia and a few others, not New York, at least initially. As you go later into the mid 19th century, particularly settling, if immigrants wanted to come to the Midwest, they usually aimed for New Orleans. And in Missouri, if you had a mid-century, 19th century immigrant ancestor, very likely they came through New Orleans. If you have an early Pennsylvania Dutch ancestor, they almost definitely came through either Philadelphia or Baltimore. And then passports. There are passports that are searchable on both Family Search and Ancestry. I think there's some duplication. But the nice thing about passports, and again, these are mostly a 1900 and after thing, there's going to be a photograph of the person. And if people have found photographs of ancestors they never knew existed. What about naturalization records? These also provide you with information about your ancestor. Uh, they extend from the colonial period, which was just basic oath of allegiance for Germans. New states and territories, if they were added to the U.S., like the Louisiana Purchase, those who were inhabitants automatically became citizens. So no records for naturalization. And the lengths of time for residency varied all over the place between 1790 and 1820, but predominantly during this time period and up to 1906, most of the records are in local courts, not federal courts. So you want to focus oftentimes on the county. The big watershed date on naturalization is 1906, when the U.S. Immigration Service started, and the focus for naturalization shifted to federal courts. So, what about family members? At some point, wives were included as being automatically citizens if their husbands became naturalized. That changed and they became naturalized in their own right. Military service, starting with the Civil War, if you served for a given length of time, you were automatically granted citizenship when you got your honorable discharge. African Americans became citizens with the 13th Amendment, and Native Americans not till 1934. So if you locate naturalizations, keep in mind it was a two-step process. You had to declare your intent to be naturalized after 0 to several years residence, and then you had another time period before you could be naturalized. It didn't have to happen in the same court. So let us look at an example here in a minute. Some details. You can look at this National Archives major immigration laws thing. Use the correct link that I provided earlier. In 1790, it just required one court visit, a 2-year residency. Pre-white aliens could become naturalized. Children of those naturalized became citizens, and mostly local courts until 1906. In 1798, the Declaration of Intent had to be filed at least 5 years before citizenship. So that's when the Declaration of Intent was added, and it required 2 court visits. 1824, alien minors became citizens automatically at age 21. Alien wives of those naturalized became citizens in 1855. And aliens honorably discharged from the military in 1862. In 1906, again, any court with common law jurisdiction, and the emphasis shifted to federal. So here's Christoph Feste, who actually is my 3 greats grandfather. I had Dickens finding him on a passenger arrival list, on a ship's passenger list. And that's because some idiot, like the captain of the ship, wrote down the surname beginning with a W. I can't even remember how I found this, but I did. I think I was playing around with wildcard and just put a wildcard for the beginning letter. And here he is, and it's definitely him because his second wife was Sophia. He came from Hanover. He's headed to Missouri from New Orleans. He has a son, Christian, a son, Herman. And I didn't even know before this record that at one point he had an infant son, Carl, who died during the passage. So he was a year and a half old when he died on the way here. And from what I know about the timing, it's very likely that Carl was probably Sophia's child. Christoph had an earlier wife who I traced back to. He filed his Declaration of Intent. You notice, I believe this is 1852. 3 years later, he filed a Declaration of Intent in the Circuit Court for Cape Girardeau County. In 1855, and then was naturalized, not in the circuit court, but in the Court of Common Pleas, which is 8 miles away from where the circuit court met. In 1860, he was naturalized, and he didn't live too many years after that. Another example, what I'm going to do is go through a number of examples of people and how research got to their immigration records. This is the guy that was my wife's great grandfather, Patrick Dallin. We have in our possession, used to belong to my father-in-law, who's deceased, a letter of reference from a parish priest in Rathvilly, County Carlow. I eagerly have been looking for the birth record, which there's a certified birth record that came from Ireland as well amongst the documents. And I can't find the original. I can't find any trace of him in Rathvilly, but obviously he was in Rathvilly. The thing that I find interesting is this is 1849, May. He didn't arrive in the US till 2 years later. So did he get this reference letter just to have it? Did he do something else or go somewhere else for 2 years? I don't know. And then we have his naturalization paper, which Washington County, Missouri is where he was naturalized. They haven't microfilmed and made it, well, they haven't made available their naturalization records anywhere. I can't find them. So we're glad we have this because it's the only record we've got so far. If I waded through circuit court records for Washington County, I'd probably find it. But he came in 1851 and he was naturalized in 1856. So I think 5 years was the requirement. That led me back to his arrival ship's passenger list, and they spelled his name Dallin rather than En, and abbreviated Patrick as Pat, but it was the 28th of March, 1851. Why is my bed open? Just a second. Came unplugged. I looked down here and I saw, oh, Blanche was the ship's name out of Liverpool. So I thought, well, I'll see if I can find any images of Blanche. And I do a search. Oh my. It turns out the Blanche was overloaded and sickness broke out, and they were blaming the sickness on the overload. But in the inquiry that resulted after this, the captain was found not liable. It turned out some bean counter in Liverpool miscalculated the area of the ship internally and allowed too many people on it. So I thought, wow, this is pretty interesting that this guy that my wife is descended from had to put up with this. And was he sick? I don't know, because it just gives a number. So I also found out that there were newspaper articles on this. I found it in the famine ships, which if you have an Irish ancestor, I highly recommend reading the famine ships about the Irish immigration. But it's also just all over the New Orleans newspapers because this dragged on for a while, and pretty interesting. Here's another one that I actually picked up on years ago, and Strasburger and Hink is kind of the classic for Pennsylvania German immigration. It's a reproduction, transcriptions of passenger lists, and the third volume is reproductions of the oaths of allegiance signatures. And I had researched this guy who turns out not to be my ancestor, not even my line. His last name is Eddleman, Philip Jacob Eddleman. And he signed the Oath of Allegiance, which I knew I had. And so I was doing research on this guy. I kind of research all Eddlemans when I can. So I was in Annapolis and at the State Archives in Maryland, where he ended up moving after living in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania for a few years. And lo and behold, rather than the clerk's signature in the deed books, Germans signed for themselves in those deed books for Baltimore County during that time period. And I looked at this and I thought, I wonder if that matches that ship's passenger list. And I'd say it's a reasonable match. It's the same guy. There's other evidence that it's the same guy as well. But the signatures on that oath of allegiance and in deed books pretty well match. Here's one that I use as an example because I was asked to get this one. I was at the National Archives for somebody that knew that this guy existed, and a friend of theirs was a descendant and the guy never even knew that he had a Civil War ancestor. So I got his pension application file. And in the compiled military service record, in that, it says he was born in Hartheim, Germany. If you know anything about World War II history, Hartheim was a pretty notorious place. One of the death camps was there. But this Henry Ninninger came from there, 100 plus years earlier. And I've looked for the ship's passenger list, and they almost had to have warped the spelling somehow so that I still haven't hit it yet. But he came over. I looked at his census for 1880, and he came over in 1851. So somewhere in those 1851 New Orleans passenger lists, I suspect he's there, spelled some oddball way. The next steps I'd do if I were actually researching this is I'd find others in the area who listed 1851 as their immigration year from the census. They may have been in the fan club for Henry Ninninger. I'd check church records to see if that mentioned. Sometimes it mentioned the ship in local church records. I'd check local histories for his biography and for other German immigrants that might have come in 1851. Local Society Quarterly, which I haven't searched yet. I did look in the Society's library. There's no Ninninger genealogy. This is a guy I've just recently researched because of some Civil War interest. He was a colonel in the militia during the Civil War, George C. Tilenius. And I looked for Tilenius and didn't get anything. And so I thought, well, I'll try wildcards. Well, if you search in Ancestry, what a wildcard is it substitutes for a text string. And the text string may be single letters, or it may be a whole bunch of letters. So I thought, well, usually what you do is you drop out the vowels and put an asterisk for a wild card. So I did that. And lo and behold, I got initially his father's immigration record, who came from Hanover and came with his family. But the son, George C., is not there. So I did some additional looking. And I found that he actually came a little bit earlier in the same year, in 1848. Well, if you know history, 1848 was the big year when a lot of revolutionary activity happened throughout several countries in Europe. And many people left Germany because they wanted to avoid being drafted. And if you're an 18-year-old and you're in Germany at this time, you wanted to maybe get out. So George did. It says C. Tilenius, but his middle name was Christoph or Christopher. So it's probably him. Not definitely, but probably. But then the other interesting thing, he came up on another ship's passenger list, arriving from Cuba a few years later. Well, the Tilenius family has a story that he went to and his biography on Wikipedia. he went to Cuba as part of his merchant activities a little bit later. And then he was there for a time and then came back. And there's the ship's passenger list where he came back from Cuba. This is one of my ancestors, Leonard Welker. He's my pre-Louisiana Purchase Missourian. Came the year before the Louisiana Purchase from Lincoln County, North Carolina. Before that, he was in Rowan County, and not because of the change in county boundaries. He was really in Rowan County. He came there from Northumberland County, Pennsylvania in about 1780. And before that, he had been a frontier ranger in the Revolutionary War. And I had not found anything in Strasburger and Hink on him. So I thought, well, gosh, this Philby thing is now on Ancestry. I think I'll give that a try. So I tried the original German spelling, which has a C stuck in there. And lo and behold, I get a hit. Actually, several hits, but none of the rest of them. He was dead by the time the other three guys appear on the list. So this is possibly him. And so I click on the details and find out where that's from. And I can't get to the original pages through Ancestry, but I can through Internet Archive. And lo and behold, I looked on Internet Archive and bang, there's that book that has that information. And what it is people served on a jury, which is substitute if they actually do that service for naturalization. And sacrament means they took an oath, I believe, to be on the jury. And it lists that he was in Northampton County before he was in Northumberland County. And I found other records like births of a couple of sons that kind of back up this move from Northampton to Northumberland. So I got Leonard. I had scads of information on Leonard Welker already, and this kind of like tied it up on this side of the ocean. I still would have to figure out where he came from in Europe. My daughter-in-law figures in here. This is her great-great-grandfather, Joseph Kratokvel, and he came over in 1902 from Bohemia, which is, you got to think boundary changes, country changes. Bohemia became, in part, Czechoslovakia and the Slovak Republic. But what was it really at the time? Who owned it? Who ruled it? It was part of Austro-Hungarian Empire. So you could say you're from Hungary or Austria or Bohemia or later Czechoslovakia, and you'd be in the same place. So here he is at age 31, coming in 1902. He's a laborer from Bohemia. The asterisks go up to, or the ditto marks go up to Illinois, is where he was headed. He had $10 and he was headed to Chicago. So, okay, he was married because his son Charles was born by this time. So this was a common thing. He came over, he made a little money, probably sent it home so that his wife and children could come over. Not only that, this is 1905. One of his nephews came with them, this Franz Halaka. And so he's saying he's going to go to an uncle, Joseph Kratokvel, and he gives the address, which I can match up with city directories. And then Teresa, his wife, that's her husband, is where she's going to in Chicago again. And then the two kids say they're going to their father's. And this one's a little bit more useful in that it lists a village, Brestlovak. And I've found out that there's more than one Brestlovak. I still haven't narrowed it down. But this was the closest I can get to turn of the century immigration research because all mine were in the country by 1850. So, and then later Joseph Kretockel was naturalized. And again, he had a different address by then, but I can match that up with a city directory. And he has witnesses. And one thing I would want to do is probably run out those witnesses to see what I could find out about them. But this matches up with his immigration date. By this time, World War I has happened, and there's a Czechoslovakia, but he puts Austria in there as well. So if you cross the pond and get over in other jurisdictions other than the US, look for similar sources in the country of origin. Plus, it's a good idea to work with foreign researchers that actually know what they're doing. There are e-migration lists in some cases. I mentioned letters of manumission or permission. Property sales may have occurred. There may be letters of recommendation, and this is that same one for Patrick Dallin. Permits to immigrate, shipping company records may be useful, and port of departure lists. Hamburg is one example. A few hints and cautions before I leave you today. You're really going to be focusing on libraries and online subscription and free services for immigration research, perhaps more than any other aspect of genealogy. Spelling may be wildly off. Try everything, use wildcards. All's fair in love, war, and trying to find a misspelled ancestor's name. The most likely port of entry may be wrong. We have papers from a Belchamber family in our collections that go back to Daniel Belchamber. You would think he came to Bullinger County, Missouri. You'd think, okay, New Orleans. No. For whatever reason, he came to Canada from Britain. He married a local Canadian lady, crossed into Michigan and had first child, and then after another child came to Bullinger County. Don't ask me why. I have no idea why. Maybe there was somebody he knew down here. I don't know. Every little tidbit of information could be important. Follow up on every possible clue in the documents you find. I have never realized since I've really delved into censuses how much is there that people are missing and should be using. Finally, read social history books about your ethnic group that you're interested in and the locale to get insight into the immigrants' experiences. There's one book in your handout, The Names of John Gergen. That was just a revelation to me about life in the Soulard area of St. Louis at the turn of the century and into the 1930s. It was just interesting as all get out for ethnic Germans who settled there after immigrating in the early 1900s. So with that, good luck with your leap across the pond. And if there are any questions, I'll take those.
So yeah, if anybody wants to grab that updated link, it is right there. And if you could just leave that up for a few moments, and then we will go ahead and pop into some of these questions. There are a bunch of questions, so I'm not sure we'll be able to get to everything today, but we will answer as many as we can here live within the next few minutes. And then if we're not able to get to yours today, we do invite you to connect with Bill, and I'll drop his email into the chat again momentarily. Another resource question that was in here I wanted to get in front of you is that you had mentioned a second grave source other than Find a Grave. Could you share what that second source was again?
Billion Graves. Billion Graves has fewer entries than Find a Grave, but it was specifically designed for genealogy use. And so when you do find something on Billion Graves, it's got really useful information. So I highly recommend Billion Graves. People tend to put stuff on Find a Grave that's extra that oftentimes is wrong.
Absolutely. Well, and in fact, Bill, you have an entire program about using cemetery records within this
Yes.
series, correct? So if you want to do a deep dive into cemetery records and the resources around that, definitely check out that program in our on-demand series. And then another resource question I thought we'd kind of get out of the way before we talk into some of these contents. You might have seen it that somebody asked if you could speak a little bit more about how the wildcard works and can you use it across multiple databases?
The wildcard varies. In Ancestry, it's the asterisk. If you are in, say, the General Land Office website, Bureau of Land Management, looking for land records, the wildcard there is the percent sign. So check to see what is used as the wildcard, or even if wildcards are allowed. Somebody pointed out that I could join the DAR, or people in the family could join the DAR under Leonard Welker. I probably should point out that you're too late. My sister has already joined under Jacob Ryan. So we've got several revolutionary ancestors.
Oh, there was also a question on here, Bill, about the August conference and asked if the program details are out on the website or when they will be, if you can speak to that.
They will be very shortly because I have a meeting with the conference committee this evening. And so we've got a couple other things to line out and then we'll blast it every which direction. So should be a pretty interesting program. We're going to really focus on things that are available at the State Historical Society and also tying it all together and how to use that stuff. Immigrants come from Europe and go back. Yes, it happened. I don't know if it was terribly common. Sometimes it was temporary, sometimes it was permanent. Same way with people immigrating within the US. They would come west and then decide, man, this stinks. I don't like this. And they go back east or bounce back and forth. Isle of Wight, Virginia, prior to 1675, someone has an ancestor that purportedly arrived then. How can you verify that information? I wish I knew. I've got so many Virginia lines that until they bought land, they're just invisible. It's tough with Virginia, particularly. Okay, if Italian immigrants return to Europe, there may be departure information that might be out there after 1900. So I'd look on the subscription and free sites and see if there's any departure information. I know I found departure information for that one Carl or Charles Cretocbel, although he was departing with the army during World War I. So look and see. I haven't done that before. Nobody in 1904 would have been an indentured servant. India Ink Cross on somebody's paternal grandfather was from Kilkenny and arrived in 1904. And under physical characteristics, it says an India Ink Cross on left wrist. There just weren't indentured servants after colonial times because the practice stopped. And particularly 1900, the cross might have just been like a tattoo. $10, was that a lot of money? Well, if you translated it to modern standards, I'm guessing it would probably be somewhere in the $100 to $200 realm, which, if you're a poor guy coming over in steerage, that was probably a good bit of money. If you want to know what the cost of passage was, I suggest reading the names of John Gergen, because I remember he discussed that. Homestead application files, somebody's asking where those are. They're in the National Archives. They are not microfilm. You have to go for the originals, and you can work with people that look things up for a fee, or you can go visit it yourself and do that, or you can send for it yourself. But it's actually probably more costly than working with someone that does it for a fee. I find it hard to read the script writing in these records. Does it get easier? Well, it got easier for me because I learned cursive. I know. Uh, but the German script, no, I can't read that. I'd have to take special training. And, oh, Africans, regarding your slide on the colonial time 1790, specifically Africans, are you referring to these Africans who were brought to this country to be enslaved as immigrants? I guess, yeah, they were forced immigrants, but they weren't here of their own volition. So obviously, uh, so given no slavery, there probably would have been very few Africans immigrating during that time period. Someone mentions their Osage or their records regarding Osage in your area online. Work with the Osage tribal government on that. There might be something on the rolls that would be on Family Search or Ancestry, but I've not researched Osage. So,
were there typical ports of entry in Canada? And are there immigration records from Canada that can be accessed?
well, just because of the distribution of people in Canada, they were more likely to be in the East. There are none that really stand out. The Canadian border, particularly, was kind of like a sieve. There wasn't a whole lot of regulation on the Canadian border early times.
And then someone had asked, could you speak to immigration from Germany and France to Southeast Missouri, especially the Perry County area?
Germany and France. French would have been early for the most part. There might have been a few people that came in the 1800s. Germans, the one most people think about is the Saxon Lutheran group that came over in the 1830s and 40s. And they have a really good archive in Altenburg. If you descend from any of those Saxon Lutherans, I would highly recommend going to that archive and doing research. The original church books are there. There are other German groups that did come into Perry County, but they were for the most part second and third generation Germans from North Carolina and other locales in the Mid-South.
Do you have a format preference for saving immigration records as you are locating them as a JPEG or a PDF or?
Not really. What's most important, no matter what format you save it in, is that you actually craft enough information to do a really good citation so you can find it again or somebody else can find it again. So
absolutely. And
I've got PDF documents, I've got JPEG documents, and heck, I probably ought to convert them all to PDF, but I haven't.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say that Bill actually covers a lot about gathering materials and citing them in your writing your family history program. That was a lot of great information about gathering and documenting those sources as you're putting it together, if folks want to check that out.
Oh, someone says they don't see a reference by Gergen. It's about Gergen. The author is Benjamin Moore, Moore. Very interesting book. The guy found this John Gergen's elementary school assignment stuffed in a dumpster in St. Louis when he was out jogging, and kind of got interested and sprang from there.
Interesting. Well, I know that there's still some questions coming in, but I see that we are well past 2:15 now. So I think we'll go ahead and get ready to wrap up here. But I did go ahead and drop Bill's email in the chat if you have a specific question you want to follow up with him about. Bill, any thoughts on what your next program might be, or are you still pondering?
Well, there's possibility of doing general military records. I've done Civil War ancestor, but that's really specific to Civil War. So
interesting.
That is a possibility as military records.
Okay. Well, that sounds fascinating. And as Bill said, if anyone has suggestions or requests or something that they would like to see a topic on, that he's open to hearing from you. And before we wrap today, Bill, is there anything else you wanted to share with the group?
Don't think so. Thanks everybody for joining me today, and hope you got some good tips on researching your immigrant ancestors.
Wonderful. Well, Bill, thank you so much, as always, for a fantastic program. I always learn so much and have so many ideas and resources available. And yes, thank you so much to everyone who was able to join us. And once we do decide on the next installment of Bill's series, that will be posted on the State Historical Society of Missouri's website as well. So thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.